But before we wet our whistles, let's talk about sex. Je t'aime, I love you. I'm fluent in French. That means I love you. I'm sure you didn't know that. Specifically movie sex scenes. We're going to talk about, yes, l'amour, toujours l'amour. See, more of that French. I'm good, aren't I? Kissing, cuddling, and often a whole lot more have played an important role in Hollywood history, but all of a sudden, evidently, specialist supervisors are required to watch over actors as they get jiggy. They're called intimacy coordinators, and they're just what the Me Too doctor ordered, but isn't this all a bit censorious, a cumbersome hindrance to the artistic process? Let's ask film critic Van Connor. Hi, Van.
Hi, Kevin, and I would argue it's not without its precedent. This has been something that's been coming for a while, and it is needed, I think.
Well, I mean, of course, we had the Hays Code in Hollywood, the moral rules of what you could and couldn't show on screen, which started in 1930 and went all the way to 1968. There were rules against profanity, licentious or suggestive nudity, excessive kissing, white slavery, mixed race sexual relationships, on and on these rules went. It's amazing that they were still there in 1968. But do we really need do we need these people watching over actors doing sex scenes?
Well, I mean, in the case of the Hays Code and the existence of intimacy coordinates, I think they're very, very disparate issues. The Hays Code was more to do with culture and censorship and what they deemed as societal norms and harmful ideas. In the case of the creation of intimacy coordinators, this, as I say, has been coming for a few years. This was started by Alicia Roddice back in 2016, before Me Too really took off. And then when Me Too started to dominate the headlines, there was then a call for this to become a thing. It's designed not to enforce anything except comfort and security, particularly for actresses. I'm not saying that's gender specific. It is, needed for male actors as well. But it is intentionally put there to prevent the exploitation of female actors who have something of, as we've discovered in the last 3 years, of a long-standing tradition, even in our current times, of being manipulated and extorted by powerful men, the likes of which we now see being tried, finally in the courts after years of being tried in the press, the likes of Harvey Weinstein, etc. And it is, as a long, long list of examples would go to prove, really for the best.
But what do these intimacy coordinators actually do?
So an intimacy coordinator operates upon the theory that performing a love scene in a film or in a TV show is no different in theory and execution to performing an action sequence or a stunt sequence. It's coordinated. Everybody involved has to be on the same page going in. There is a creative vision. There's a storyboarded idea. There's choreography. Everything has to be pre-planned. Everyone has to be on the same page and everyone has to be comfortable with what they're doing. You wouldn't expect a stuntman to jump off a building if he didn't feel completely comfortable with doing it. The same rules should absolutely apply to a 19-year-old actress, to a 55-year-old male actor. The same rules have to apply across the board, and they work upon a concept known as the 5 pillars. And these are the 5 C's: context, consent, communication, choreography, and closure. And each one corresponds to an ideal, a criteria that must be met in the eyes of the intimacy coordinator, who will be there on set throughout the filming of these scenes to ensure that everything is above board and everybody's on the same page.
So what's the implication here then, Van, that until we had intimacy coordinators, that male actors were abusing these sex scenes and getting it on?
There are cases of that. More often than not, actually, it would always be producers and particularly directors. A very famous example, one that always comes up in conversations about consent within love scenes in films, is Bernardo Bertolucci and the filming of The Last Tango in Paris. The famous, we'll just say the butter scene, because we can't describe it in much more detail than that for, radio reasons.
It was sex involving butter, yeah.
It was sex involving butter, and Maria Schneider, the female participant in that scene, was not told until moments before the camera started rolling about the introduction of this element. It wasn't there to begin with. Brando and Bertolucci had decided this between themselves, and she has gone on record many, many times to say that the tears she wound up crying were of humiliation and shame. She felt exploited. She came to, in later years, absolutely despise Bertolucci. She blames him for the demise of her career, for it never going anywhere, because quite simply she was demoralized and destroyed. And this carries on on today. Helen Mirren has always said that the only reason she did so many of her iconic nude scenes was because she didn't want to be seen as a prude. And even as recently as the last 5 or 6 years, Game of Thrones, Emilia Clarke has said that the producers of that exploited the fact that she was fresh out of drama school, that she was young and inexperienced, to basically force her into a number of nude scenes that, frankly, she felt very uncomfortable with. And that show literally made its bones upon the back of graphic nude scenes and completely inappropriate sex scenes.
I wonder in Last Tango in Paris if the butter was salted or unsalted. I think we should find that out. But a very famous sex scene was in Don't Look Now, Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie, and the legend is that it's very, very realistic, and in fact, it was real.
It's one of those, it's apocryphal, there are different takes on it. Michael Winterbottom had the same thing with 9 Songs this century as well. We had a very similar conversation about that. The conversation about whether or not love scenes are real, no one ever knows, unless they worked on the film. It's either something of legend or it's fact, and there's never a sort of deciding line between the two of them. One famous example that came up recently, and this happened since the whole Harvey Weinstein scandal, was Salma Hayek came forward to discuss the film Frida, the Frida Kahlo biopic that she'd been very involved in making for more than 20 years. Yeah. Exactly. Harvey Weinstein was the producer on that, and famously, apparently strong-armed her into a graphic, fully nude lesbian love scene that he insisted had to be included, otherwise the film would be shut down. And this was a film that was already in production. It would be shut down, and there would simply be no more. Now, she went ahead with it. She had no issue with the sexual content of it. It was simply being strong-armed and being forced into it. And she, later reported to have had a nervous breakdown over it. She claimed she couldn't focus. She was crying. She was broken down. She was shaking. She simply couldn't focus at all after that. This is the kind of thing we're talking about. Having people ensuring that that's not the case anymore can only be for the best. There's no negative to that whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, it does. One thing about sex scenes is, for me, and I think lots of other people, it's time to go and get your popcorn. It's so boring. But sex does sell, and I do slightly worry that these kind of rather weird-sounding people, intimacy coordinators, are signs of us becoming more prudish, more Victorian about this sort of thing. And I'm not sure that is progress.
That's the thing as well, because that's a very easy misinterpretation to make, and I can understand completely how you would arrive at that conclusion. These intimacy coordinators are not there in any way to influence the narrative. They're not there to influence the content whatsoever. They are there purely for the sake of the actors and the filmmakers. They are there to ensure, like I say, it all goes back to the 5 C's, the context, the consent, the communication, the choreography, and the closure. And you go through that, and you break down what those 5 points actually mean. And it very quickly points at quite a pleasant picture that everyone here is working in a very positive way. No one's saying don't make 50 Shades of Grey. No one's saying that what's... I mean, don't get me wrong, in terms of how awful the film, absolutely never make 50 Shades of Grey. It's a terrible movie. But no one's saying don't make films like that. They're simply saying the people involved in making these films have to all be on the same page. Everyone has to be above board. Everyone has to agree with what they're doing, understand the mindset. There's the closure element of those 5 pillars, I think, is in particular one that does have serious attention paid to it, which is that actors are encouraged to mark the end of each scene of this nature that's been filmed with a moment to signal the return of, and it's quoted as, real life interaction. It is a moment in which both actors have to share a moment that simply says, right, we are done filming, okay, we're taking ourselves out of that headspace. That was an act, let's not misinterpret anything. And I think that is a very, very important, very pivotal point that has to be focused on.
Ian McShane, just before you go, Van, Ian McShane was on a film set where he encountered an intimacy coordinator and was told that this person would be marching around the set, and he said, well, okay, fair enough. What are their qualifications? So what are the qualifications of a person who stands there watching sex scenes and makes sure they don't get out of control? What do they need to be? What kind of people are they?
They tend to be, from my experience, women who have worked in theatre and in drama and in movement coordination. Alicia Rodis, who was one of the founders of the Intimacy Directors International Organisation, the IDI, other members of that Certainly have, since gone on to form their own organisations. The IDI was dissolved as recently as March, but the number of people working there did tend to work in movement specialisation, choreography and things like that. But in the case of Alicia Rollins in particular, she founded that initiative based on experiences she herself had had in theatre. Having been on the receiving end of directors who put her in positions she, felt uncomfortable with at the time, that didn't sit right with her, that simply festered and lingered and hindered her mentally and psychologically, and more as time went on. And it does become about choreography, about movement and blocking and making sure that the actress or actor within that scene feels comfortable with being shown in this particular light. If you remember Basic Instinct, one of the most famous things we remember about Basic Instinct is, the famous interrogation room scene. Yeah. And the story goes that Sharon Stone was wearing underwear when they filmed that. And Paul Verhoeven, who, don't get me wrong, outside of this, one of my favourite directors. I love me some RoboCop, love me some Starship Troopers all the time in the world. But he said during the filming of that scene, do you know what? They're distracting from the eye line. Can you take them off? We won't show anything. Don't worry. It's just we don't want to distract the eye line. When it got to the first screening of that movie that Sharon Stone was present for, she discovered what we all now know as the iconic moment of that interrogation room scene. She famously took Paul Verhoeven into the booth and slapped him across the face and then gave him a verbal dressing down. And it's about that.
Well, I think
she wouldn't have done it.
I think that what Paul could have told her is the sex sells, and I'm afraid that kind of thing kind of always will happen, but perhaps these intimacy coordinators will make things not quite so bad. Listen, Van, great talking to you. That was Van Connor, film critic on sex scenes and intimacy coordinators. I'm Kevin O'Sullivan, and this is Talk Radio.